She stood before the mirror in her private dressing room, wearing a white wedding dress, listening to the organ music drifting from downstairs. And in that very moment, she saw the man soon to be her husband kissing her younger sister. Not a stolen kiss. Not a momentary lapse. It was the touch of two people who had known each other for a very long time. And the necklace around her sister's neck, it was her mother's heirloom, meant only for the bride today. But this is the part that will keep you glued to the screen. The man who saved her from hell is the city's most dangerous criminal. Please like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything. The morning of the wedding, Serafina Vale threw up twice. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself every bride felt this way. The stomach clenching, the shallow breathing, the sense that the ground beneath her heels had turned to something soft and unreliable. She stood at the bathroom sink in the bridal suite of St. Carver's Grand Cathedral and ran cold water over both wrists and stared at herself in the mirror until her reflection stopped looking so much like a stranger wearing her face. The dress was perfect. That was the terrible thing. It fit exactly the way it was supposed to. Ivory silk with a cathedral-length train that rustled when she walked and caught the light in a way that made photographers openly emotional during fittings. Her hair was pinned up with pearl-tipped clips that had belonged to her grandmother. Her skin was calm. Her posture was impeccable. She looked like the cover of a magazine called American Dream, and she felt like the inside of a car that had just rolled off a bridge. 400 guests were waiting downstairs. Senators, hedge fund managers, 3 federal judges and a deputy mayor. Celebrities who had flown private from Los Angeles and socialites who considered Damian Cross's wedding the cultural event of the spring season. The Cross family had rented the cathedral, not booked it. There was a difference. The distinction mattered to Damian's mother, who had repeated it twice during the rehearsal dinner while looking directly at Serafina's father as though he needed to understand his place in the social taxonomy. Serafina had smiled through it. She was good at smiling through things. Her maid of honor, a college friend named Priya, had done a final check of the veil 20 minutes ago and kissed her cheek and said, "You're going to be incredible in the voice people use when they mean, 'Please don't fall apart in front of 400 people.'" Then Priya had gone downstairs to coordinate the bridesmaids, and Serafina was alone with herself in the mirror and the sound of the organ warming up somewhere below like a slow, ornate heartbeat. She needed to find Damian. That was what she told herself. It was a reasonable thing. 5 minutes before a wedding ceremony, a bride wanting to see the man she was about to marry, to stand beside him for one quiet second before the doors opened and the performance began. She had read somewhere that some cultures considered it bad luck to see the groom before the ceremony. She had never believed in that. She had never honestly believed in much of anything fragile. The hallway outside the bridal suite was empty. Marble floors, tall windows, afternoon light cutting in sideways and catching the dust motes in the air. The sound of the organ was clearer out here, working its way through some classical piece she couldn't name. She walked toward Damian's private preparation room at the far end of the hall in her heels, her train gathered in one hand, feeling faintly absurd, like an actress who had wandered onto the wrong stage. She heard them before she reached the door. Not words, just sound. The kind of sound that has its own particular weight, that you recognize before your brain has finished processing what it means. She stopped walking. The door was not fully closed, a 2-inch gap between door and frame, and through it, light from a vanity mirror, and through that light, movement. She pushed the door open slowly, not because she didn't know what she would find, because some part of her needed to be certain. Damian Cross stood with his back half turned toward the vanity, his tuxedo jacket off, his white shirt untucked at one side. He had one hand braced against the mirror's frame, and the other was tangled in the dark hair of the woman pressed against him, and they were kissing with the ease of people who had been doing it long enough to stop being self-conscious about it. The woman's shoulders were bare above the fabric of her dress. The back of her neck was familiar. The line of her jaw was familiar. The necklace at her throat was familiar in a way that made Serafina's lungs stop working. 3 strands of antique gold with a central sapphire pendant. Her mother's necklace, the one her father had placed in Serafina's hand 6 weeks ago with both of his shaking and said, "Your mother always meant this for your wedding day." the one that had lived in a velvet case in Serafina's closet for 3 years, that she had taken out twice just to look at, because looking at it made the grief feel clean instead of ragged. The woman wearing it was Celeste Vale, her sister, 24 years old, 5 years younger. Standing in Damien Cross's preparation room in a pale green dress that cost more than Serafina's first car, wearing their dead mother's jewelry, kissing the man Serafina was supposed to marry in 43 minutes. Serafina said nothing. The sound that came out of her wasn't words. It was something earlier than words. A sharp intake of breath that she couldn't control, that she would have died to take back. Damien's head turned first. He looked at her across the room, and his expression did something she would spend the next year trying to name. It was not guilt, exactly. It was closer to the face a person makes when they have spilled something on a carpet and are already calculating how to minimize the cleanup. Celeste pushed away from him fast, both hands flying to her mouth, her eyes going wide. Neither of them spoke. Serafina looked at Damien's face for a long time. Long enough that the silence in the room became structural, load-bearing, the kind of silence that if you removed it, the whole architecture of the moment would collapse. "Sarah," Celeste started. "Don't." Her own voice surprised her, flat and dry and very quiet. "Don't say my name." Damien straightened. He reached for his jacket on the chair beside him with a deliberateness that struck her as almost clinical, and he put it on, and he adjusted his lapels, and then he looked at her with that particular expression of his that she had always read as composure, and understood now was simply indifference wearing better clothes. "This isn't what it looks like," he said. It was such a profoundly stupid thing to say that she almost laughed. "Damien," her voice was still quiet, "I have eyes." Something shifted in his face then. The composure cracked just slightly, and what was underneath it was not remorse. It was irritation. A man who had been caught not in something shameful but in something inconvenient, the way you might feel if someone interrupted you during a phone call. "Look," he said, "we should talk about this after the ceremony. This doesn't have to after the ceremony. People are waiting. Your father is down there. My investors. My father." The words came out of her mouth and then just sat there, exposed, trembling at the edges. Her father, who had spent 6 months planning this wedding with the focused energy of a man trying to outrun his own grief, who had written a toast that he'd practiced in front of the bathroom mirror at home, who was sitting in the front pew right now in the new suit he'd bought specifically because the old one no longer fit correctly since her mother died. Celeste made a sound that might have been the beginning of an apology. Serafina looked at her sister. Really looked at her, in a way she hadn't in maybe years, the way you stop looking at the people closest to you once you've cataloged them and filed them away. Celeste was pale beneath her makeup. Her lipstick was smudged. She was holding her hands together at the waist the way she'd done as a child when she was trying to make herself smaller. And for one devastating second, Serafina saw her sister at 9 years old in their parents' kitchen, caught taking something that didn't belong to her, making that same shape with her hands. "How long?" Serafina said. Not a question, entirely. More like a measurement. Celeste didn't answer. "How long?" Harder this time. "Sarah, it was never supposed to—" "Celeste." Just the name. And Celeste went quiet. Damien said, "You were always the safe choice." The room went absolutely still. He said it the way you state a fact. No heat, no cruelty beyond the ordinary cruelty of clarity. As though this explained everything. As though she had asked him to justify some corporate acquisition and he had simply laid out the strategic reasoning. You were always the safe choice. The kind of sentence that, once you've heard it, you realize you have been carrying the proof of it for years without understanding what you were holding. Serafina felt something happen in her chest. Not breaking, exactly. More like the moment a bone sets wrong, a realignment into a shape that will change the architecture of everything that follows. She turned and walked out of the room. She did not slam the door. She closed it, which was somehow worse. The hallway was still empty. The organ was still playing. She walked back toward the bridal suite on legs that felt borrowed from someone else, and she sat down on the edge of the fainting couch by the window and looked at her hands folded in her lap and breathed with extreme precision, The way you breathe when breathing is the only thing you have full control over. She was still sitting there when she heard the first whisper of noise from downstairs. The way sound changes when 400 people all begin talking at once. A shift in atmospheric pressure, almost. A collective murmur that vibrated up through the floorboards. She didn't have to go to the window to understand what had happened. The murmur had a particular quality to it. Shock has a sound. She had heard it once before at her mother's hospital, in the hallway outside the ICU, when the doctor came out and said the words no one in the family was ready for. Someone had leaked the photos. She didn't know this yet. She wouldn't know it until Priya ran back upstairs 20 minutes later with her phone and her eyes showing white at the edges. But the security footage from the hallway outside Damien's preparation room had been pulled and screenshotted within minutes of whatever bystander had seen Serafina walk out. The images were already circulating. The wedding of the year had detonated before the ceremony began, and it was doing so publicly, in real time, the way catastrophes do in the age of people with phones and no patience. Serafina heard the change in sound from the cathedral below, and she sat on the fainting couch in her wedding dress and did not cry. Not because she wasn't wrecked. She was wrecked in a way that went well below the waterline, damage she couldn't fully assess yet. The kind that only reveals itself later when you try to function normally and discover that certain load-bearing parts are gone, but she had learned a long time ago, somewhere around her mother's third hospitalization, that crying in the middle of the crisis used energy you needed for other things. Grief could wait. Grief had to wait. What she needed right now was to stand up. She stood up. She walked to the door of the bridal suite and opened it, and before she could think better of it, she walked down the hallway toward the staircase, and at the top of the stairs she stopped because she could see the cathedral floor below, and she could see the guests, some still seated, most standing, all of them turned toward the entrance hall with their phones out, or their hands over their mouths, or both. And she could see her father. Arthur Vale was standing at the end of the entrance hall with one hand pressed flat against the wall. His face was gray in a way that had nothing to do with the light. He was looking at something Serafina couldn't see from this angle, and there was an expression on his face she recognized from the hospital, the one he'd worn in the hallway outside the ICU before the doctor came out, when he'd known but didn't yet know. Then someone was at her father's elbow. She couldn't see who. He turned toward them, and his legs seemed to stop holding him properly, and the person at his elbow caught him before he went down, and then there was more noise from below. Not just murmur now, but voices raised, people moving. Serafina started down the stairs. She was halfway down when the doors at the far end of the cathedral opened, and Damien Cross walked in. Not through the back entrance, not quietly. He walked through the main entrance of the cathedral on Celeste's arm, moving through the gathered guests with the composed, unhurried gait of a man who had decided that if the crisis was already public, the most powerful position was to own the narrative. Celeste was on his arm in her green dress with her dark hair and their mother's necklace at her throat, and the expression on her face was something between triumph and terror. The face of someone who has wanted something for so long that finally getting it has short-circuited the part of her brain that was supposed to feel happy about it. 400 people watched them cross the floor, and then 400 people went completely silent, because someone else had just walked through the doors behind them. Serafina felt it before she saw it. The way the atmosphere in the room changed, not just quiet, but quiet. A different quality of attention, the way a room feels when something with significant mass enters it. She was on the landing now, visible to the guests below, her train gathered in one fist and her chin up by pure instinct, the kind of posture that gets drilled into you early enough that it survives even catastrophe. She looked toward the doors. Lucien Moretti walked into the cathedral alone. He was 40, maybe 41, the kind of age that looks different on men who have been through hard things. Not softened by it, but worn smooth, like river rock. Tall, broad through the shoulders in a way his dark suit didn't attempt to minimize. Black hair with the first threads of gray at the temples. A face that would not have been called handsome exactly, but was the kind of face you did not look away from quickly, that had too much happening in it to dismiss. He moved through the crowd, and the crowd moved for him without being asked, the way water moves for something with sufficient density. She knew who he was. Everyone in New York knew who Lucien Moretti was. You didn't have to travel in certain circles to know the name. It appeared in newspapers on the business page and occasionally on the front page, usually in proximity to words like investigation and alleged and sources close to. He was the man behind the Moretti Syndicate, which the FBI had spent 11 years trying to dismantle and had managed only to tax. He was the man Damian Cross had spent 3 years publicly attempting to destroy through a combination of corporate acquisition and political pressure, and who had responded to each attempt with a patience that people who knew him described as frightening. He walked through the silent cathedral and stopped 12 feet from Serafina. Then he looked up at her on the landing, and she looked down at him. And for a moment that lasted longer than it had any business lasting, it was just the two of them in that cathedral full of cameras and frozen guests and someone's phone recording everything. His eyes were very dark. His expression was unreadable but not cold. Something in it that she couldn't name. Something that did not belong on the face of a man who had walked into a stranger's ruined wedding and stopped. He walked to the foot of the stairs. He extended his hand upward toward her, palm up, and he looked at her with those dark eyes, and the cathedral was so quiet she could hear the candles. "Marry me instead," he said. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Someone behind her made a sound. Someone else in the gathered crowd said something quickly, quietly, to the person beside them. She heard Damian's voice from somewhere across the room, sharp, controlled, a single word she couldn't quite make out. Serafina looked down at Lucien Moretti's upturned hand. She was 29 years old. She had spent the last 4 years building her life around a man who had just told her she was a safe choice. Her father was somewhere in this room, gray-faced and frightened. Her sister was on Damian Cross's arm wearing their dead mother's jewelry. There were 400 witnesses and approximately 12 cameras, and she was standing on a staircase in a cathedral in a dress that cost $11,000 with nowhere to go. She looked at the hand. She looked at the man. She breathed once, very slowly. And then Serafina Vale walked down the stairs and placed her hand in Lucien Moretti's, and the camera shutters went off like a burst of small explosions. And somewhere across the cathedral, she heard Damian Cross say her name in a voice she had never heard from him before, something in it that sounded almost like the beginning of panic, and she did not look at him. She looked only at Lucien, who was looking only at her, and whose expression had shifted by a fraction of a degree into something that, if she had to name it under oath, she might have called recognition. "All right," she said. Her voice was level. Her hand in his was steady. She had no idea what she was doing or what came next, or whether any version of this ended without someone bleeding, but she had made her decision, and she was done reversing herself for men who treated her like a contingency plan. Lucien closed his hand around hers. The silence in the cathedral lasted one more beat, and then the room erupted. Serafina kept her eyes forward as Lucien turned with her hand in his, and they walked together through the chaos. The shouting guests, the flashing phones, a security guard who stepped into their path, and then stepped back when Lucien looked at him, Damian's voice somewhere behind them rising with an edge that was unmistakably fear, and they pushed through the cathedral's main doors into the afternoon light. Outside, a black car was waiting at the curb. The driver had the door open before they reached it. "You don't know anything about me," Serafina said, not looking at him. "I know enough," Lucien said. She stopped walking, turned, looked at his face in the pale afternoon light, this man she had seen in newspapers, this man her ex-fiancé apparently feared enough to spend years and millions trying to destroy. "That's not reassuring." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, the architecture of one. It wasn't meant to be. She looked at the open car door. She looked at the cathedral entrance behind them where 2 of Damian's security men had appeared in the doorway, watching. She looked at Lucien Moretti, who was watching her with that expression she still couldn't read and making no move to hurry her. She got in the car, and as the door closed behind her and the city began moving past the tinted windows and the cathedral with its ruined white roses and its 400 witnesses fell away behind them, Serafina pressed her palms flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking and thought about the way Damian's voice had sounded when he said her name as she walked away. Not angry, afraid. For the first time since she'd walked into that preparation room and found her world in pieces, something sharp moved through her that was not grief and not humiliation, and not the particular nauseating shame of being publicly destroyed. It felt, disturbingly, like the beginning of something. She pressed her lips together and watched New York move past the glass and did not look at the man sitting across from her, who had not spoken since the car pulled away from the curb, who sat with his hands loose at his knees and his eyes on something outside the window, and who, she would discover much later, had walked into that cathedral with no plan beyond the one that had formed in the 20 seconds between entering the doors and seeing her face on that landing. The radio in the car was off. The city moved past them, indifferent and enormous and full of consequences that hadn't arrived yet. And somewhere back at the cathedral, as the guests dispersed into the afternoon and the photographers uploaded their shots, and the first news alerts began hitting phones across New York, Damian Cross stood in the entrance hall and watched the black car disappear around the corner with the expression of a man who has just discovered that a game he thought he was winning has different rules than he understood. He pulled his phone out, made a call, said 3 words. The person on the other end of the line was silent for a moment. Then they said, "Are you certain?" And Damian Cross, who had never in his life been uncertain about anything he wanted badly enough, said yes. The car ride took 40 minutes. Neither of them spoke for the first 20. Serafina sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap and watched the city transition outside the tinted glass, Midtown giving way to the upper avenues opening into the bridge approach, and then the bridge itself, the East River dark and flat below them, and on the other side of it, a part of the city she didn't know well. She noticed details the way you notice things when your brain is too overloaded to process the large picture and defaults, instead to the granular. A dent in the door panel to her left, the faint smell of cedar and something chemical in the car's interior, the driver's eyes in the rear-view mirror, never once flicking toward her. Lucien sat across from her with one knee crossed over the other and his phone face down on the seat beside him and his eyes on the window. He had the stillness of a man who had learned to wait. Not the stillness of patience exactly, but of something more deliberate, a controlled expenditure of nothing until the moment expenditure became necessary. After 20 minutes, he said, without looking at her, "You can take the necklace off." She had forgotten she was wearing it. Her hand went to her throat automatically, found bare skin, found the pearl clips in her hair instead. "I'm not wearing a necklace." He glanced at her then. "I know. I meant the one your sister was wearing." A pause. "You keep touching your throat." She lowered her hand. "It was my mother's," she said. "I know that too." She looked at him. "You seem to know a great deal about me for someone who walked into my wedding uninvited." "I was invited," Lucien said, "by Damian. He sends invitations to everyone he wants to watch him perform." But she absorbed that. "And you went." "I go to everything Damian Cross hosts. He said it the way you state a policy. It's useful to watch him perform, to watch him make mistakes." He turned back to the window. Today he made several. The car turned off the main road and through a gate that opened before they reached it and closed behind them with a sound like finality. They drove up a long approach through trees that had been there long enough to have opinions about it, and when the house came into view, Serafina understood immediately that the word house was inadequate for what she was looking at. It was stone. Old stone, the color of storm clouds, 3 stories with wings extending on either side and a facade that faced the water. Not elegant in the way of design things. Elegant in the way of things that have lasted long enough to earn it. The Atlantic was visible beyond it, gunmetal in the afternoon light, and the sound of it reached her when the car door opened, constant, enormous, indifferent. She stood on the gravel drive in her wedding dress and looked at the house and felt a laugh try to climb out of her throat and strangled it. "You live here," she said. "We live here," Lucien said from beside her. She turned to look at him. "Temporarily," he added, and she couldn't tell if he was being precise or diplomatic, and she was too exhausted to ask. Inside, the house was not what she expected. She had built an image from the newspapers: opulence, ostentation, the grammar of new money trying to speak old. What she found instead was space, high ceilings with exposed beams, floors that had been walked on long enough to hold the memory of it, books on actual shelves, not arranged by color, a kitchen that smelled like someone had been cooking recently, garlic and something acidic, and a large table with chairs that didn't match each other. A man was at the table. He was younger than Lucien by 10 years at least, Mid-20s, dark-haired, with Lucian's bone structure softened by youth and something less guarded in his face. He looked up when they came in, and his eyes went from Lucien to Serafina and stayed there. Not rude exactly, but openly surprised, taking in the wedding dress with an expression he didn't quite manage to neutralize. "Marco," Lucien said. "Yeah." The younger man stood, extended his hand toward Serafina. "Marco Moretti." "Serafina Vele," she said, and shook his hand, because apparently this was her life now, shaking hands with strangers in their kitchens while still wearing $11,000 worth of ivory silk. "I know who you are." Marco glanced at Lucien. "It's all over the news." "I'm aware." "Every news. International. They're showing the cathedral footage on a loop." He pulled out his phone, held it up. The screen showed a news banner in Italian. "My cousin in Rome texted me." "Marco." Lucian's voice was the kind of quiet that functions as a volume control for other people. Marco put the phone away. A woman appeared from the hallway off the kitchen. 50s, gray-haired, with the efficient posture of someone who has run a large household long enough to have opinions about everyone who enters it. She looked at Serafina without surprise, which was its own kind of information, and said something to Lucien in Italian that Serafina didn't catch. "She'll need a room prepared," Lucien said in English, which Serafina understood was for her benefit. "And something that isn't a wedding dress." The woman looked at Serafina's dress with the expression of a seamstress who has just been handed a problem. "Size." "4," Serafina said. The woman nodded and disappeared. Marco said, "Dinner's in an hour." Serafina said, "I need to call my father." Both Moretti men looked at her. "He was at the cathedral. She stopped. The image of her father's gray face against the wall came back with a clarity that hit her somewhere below the sternum. "He's not well. He needs to know where I am," Lucien said to Marco. "Find out where Arthur Vale is. Make sure he has whatever he needs." Then to Serafina, "You can call him from the study. It's private." She called her father from a room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a window that looked out over the water. And when he answered on the second ring, his voice had the texture of something scraped raw, and she had to press her back against the bookshelf and breathe through her nose for a moment before she could speak. "Dad? Sarah?" A pause. "Are you—" "I'm fine. I'm all right. Where are you?" "Hospital." The word landed on her like something falling. "Just precautionary," they said. "My blood pressure." Another pause, and she heard him exhale slowly, the long, controlled exhale of a man trying to sound more collected than he was. "The doctor says I'm fine, just the stress of the... Dad." She closed her eyes. "I know." "Celeste is..." He stopped, started again. "I don't know where she is." "She's with Damien." Silence. "Dad, I'm here." His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. "Serafina, this man The news is saying..." "I know what the news is saying. I know who he is." "Do you?" Not a question. "Well enough," she said, which was not exactly true, but was the truest thing she had available. "I'm safe. I'll come see you tomorrow. Will you... Can you just rest tonight? Can you do that for me?" He was quiet long enough that she could hear the hospital ambient noise in the background. Then, "Your mother's necklace." Her throat closed. "We'll get it back," she said, when she could. She sat in the study for a while after the call ended, in the chair by the window, watching the Atlantic move. It had no particular opinion about the day she'd had. The water went on doing what water does, advancing, retreating, perpetually rewriting the same line on the rocks. Dinner was at a table in the kitchen because, as Marco explained without much ceremony, the dining room was being used for something else, and he said it in the specific way that meant he was not going to elaborate and she should not ask. She changed from the wedding dress into dark trousers and a gray sweater the housekeeper had produced from somewhere, and she sat at the mismatched table and ate pasta that was better than anything she'd had in the last 6 months and tried to hold herself together with both hands. Marco talked too much. It seemed to be his natural condition. He talked about the house, about the fishing off the point in autumn, about a restaurant in the city he was attempting to open with two partners, and the regulatory problems this was generating, and he talked with the relentless energy of someone who has learned early that filling silence is the safest way to prevent it from filling with something worse. Lucian ate and said almost nothing, and twice caught Serafina watching him from across the table. Neither of them looked away immediately. After Marco disappeared to take a phone call he said he'd been waiting for, Lucian poured coffee and set a cup in front of her without asking, and sat back down and said, "Ask what you actually want to ask." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Why did you do it?" "Today, you mean?" "At the cathedral, yes." He considered the question the way he seemed to consider most things, not performing consideration but actually doing it, taking the necessary time, which was a quality she had almost never encountered in men who had enough power that no one made them wait for anything. "Damien Cross has spent 3 years trying to destroy my business operations through legislative channels," he said. "He has bribed 2 city council members and a state senator. He has planted 3 separate stories with the financial press designed to affect my credit lines. He has done all of this because 11 years ago, his father, Gerald Cross, used Damien's company as a vehicle to orchestrate a fraud scheme that bankrupted my father's legitimate shipping business and put him in the ground 2 years later." She was quiet. "Today was an opportunity," Lucian said. "Walking out of that cathedral with you was visible. A statement." "Yes. So I'm a statement." "You were a statement," he said, "for approximately the length of time it took us to drive across the bridge." She looked at him. "What are you now?" he continued. "I'm still determining that." He said it without irony, which was somehow the most alarming version of it. "What I know is that Damien Cross is obsessed with owning things other men want. Taking you from him publicly was an injury he will not, biologically cannot, recover from without retaliating. So you've made me a target. You were already a target the moment he decided you weren't useful enough to keep." He wrapped his hands around his own cup. "At least here you have walls." "And the man behind the walls," she said carefully, "wants what exactly?" A pause. "Right now," Lucien said, "a reasonable night's sleep and for Damien Cross to make the mistake I've been waiting 3 years for him to make." He looked at her directly. "You being here may accelerate that. And after that?" He didn't answer immediately. "Let's survive the next week first." She thought about pressing it, decided against it, filed it. "The necklace," she said instead. "Yes. My mother's necklace. Celeste has it." "I know. I want it back." Lucian looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Just that." The next morning she woke at 5:30 to the sound of voices from somewhere below, low, urgent, in Italian, followed by the sound of a door. She lay in the bed in the room they'd given her, which was large and sparsely furnished and smelled of old wood and the sea. And she stared at the ceiling and ran through the previous day the way you run your tongue over a broken tooth, repeatedly, compulsively, mapping the damage. By 7, she was in the kitchen. Marco was already there, on his phone, with the specific electric alertness of someone who has either not slept or slept badly. He looked up when she appeared, said something quickly into the phone, and put it down. "There's coffee," he said. "What happened?" Not a question. She'd heard it in his voice. Marco picked up his coffee and put it down and picked it up again. "Damien Cross held a press statement at 6 this morning." She waited. "He called Lucien he used the word predator. He said he implied you were coerced." Marco's jaw tightened. "He's claiming you were emotionally compromised and that Lucien took advantage of the situation to use you as a pawn in a personal vendetta." The coffee she was holding was hot enough to feel through the ceramic. She focused on that. "He's also filed a complaint with the DA's office," Marco continued, "alleging that Lucien has been conducting illegal surveillance on Cross Corp operations." "Has he?" Marco blinked. "Has Lucien been conducting illegal surveillance on Cross Corp?" "That's..." Marco stopped. "That's not really a question I can answer." "Then don't." She put the coffee down. "Where is Lucien?" "He was in a room she hadn't been in." On the far east wing of the house, a large space that might have been a ballroom in some previous century and was now a working room of considerable controlled intensity. 3 men she hadn't seen before sat at a long table with laptops and phones and the focused silence of people in the middle of something intricate. Maps on the wall. A whiteboard with names connected by lines. Lucian stood with his back to the door on the phone and did not turn when she entered but held up one finger. Wait, which she chose to interpret as, I know you're there, rather than be patient with me, because there was a difference. She looked at the whiteboard. Damien's name was on it, connected by lines to other names, politicians, corporate entities, a federal prosecutor named Winslow, connected also to a name that surprised her, Hartley, Private Capital. She knew that name. Her father's company had a line of credit with Hartley, had specifically because it had been called in 6 months ago without explanation. She was still looking at the whiteboard when Lucian ended the call. Hartley Capital, she said. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him. They called in my father's business credit 6 months ago, she said. His company nearly collapsed. He had to sell the East Warehouse. Damien directed that, Lucian said. She turned her head to look at him. He was pressuring Arthur Vale to push the wedding forward, Lucien said. Financial leverage. He needed the Crossvale merger optics for a regulatory filing in March. He paused. Your father didn't know. She breathed. He bankrupted my father, she said, to make me marry him faster. Lucian said nothing. And now, she said, he's standing in front of cameras at 6 a.m. calling me a victim. Yes. She looked back at the whiteboard, at Damien's name in the center of the web, at all the lines radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, connecting to leverage points that spanned 3 years of quiet, methodical violence dressed up in a suit and calling itself business. She thought about the preparation room, the vanity mirror, her mother's necklace. You were always the safe choice. Something solidified in her chest. Not rage. She'd felt rage yesterday, and it had been hot and formless and exhausting. This was different, cooler, like the temperature of a decision. Show me everything, she said. Lucian looked at her. You've been building a case against him for 3 years, she said. Show me what you have. Why? Because I know things about Damien Cross's operation that you don't, she said. Business dinners he took me to, conversations I wasn't supposed to be paying attention to, names, dates, documents I handled because I was the fiancé, and people get careless around decorative women. She held his gaze. I was inside that world for 4 years. Use that. The room was quiet. One of the men at the table had stopped typing. Lucien studied her face for a long moment with those dark eyes that gave very little back. All right, he said. Same words as the night before. Same weight. She pulled out a chair at the long table and sat down, and one of the men slid a legal pad toward her, and she picked up the pen and did not think about the cathedral or the dress still hanging in the room upstairs or her father's voice on the phone or Celeste's face in the mirror. She thought about Hartley Capital. She thought about a dinner in February where Damien had stepped outside to take a call and left her with a man named Pritchard who handled Damien's regulatory filings and who had drunk too much of the wine and said too many things while she sat across from him looking attentive and forgettable. She started writing, and 2 floors above them, in the room where she'd left it, her phone was receiving messages. 17 from numbers she didn't recognize. 4 from Priya. 1 from a number labeled Only See that she had not opened and would not open until 3 days later, when she did, and found 4 words. I need to talk. She didn't respond to it for another week. And in that week, Damien Cross, publicly calm, privately unraveling, made 3 phone calls to a man whose name was on none of Lucien's whiteboards yet, a man who operated in the specific shadows between federal tolerance and private capital, a man who had done difficult things for the Cross family for a long time, and who was, when reached, not surprised to receive the call. Because the man on the other end of those calls had been waiting for this exact situation for 11 years. And the woman who had just walked into Lucien Moretti's war room and picked up a pen had no idea. The name came to Serafina on the 4th day. She was sitting at the long table in the east wing with a second cup of coffee going cold beside her and a legal pad that had accumulated 47 pages of notes in her handwriting, names, dates, the texture of overheard conversations reconstructed from memory, with the precision of someone who had spent 4 years being underestimated in rooms full of powerful men. She had learned early in her relationship with Damien that the most useful position at a dinner table was the decorative one. People spoke freely around beautiful women they had decided were not listening. She had always been listening. The name she wrote on the 48th page was Reeves Mitchell, CrossCorp Outside Counsel, 2019 to present. Present at the Hartley dinner. Present also at the Meridian closing, March. Handled the regulatory filings personally. Knows where everything is buried. She stared at it. Then she wrote beneath it. Also present, conversation row. Federal exposure, the word Glassman. Repeated twice. Damien shut it down fast. She underlined Glassman. Lucien was behind her before she heard him move. She was learning that about him, the way he occupied space without announcing it, the way you became aware of him through atmospheric change rather than sound. He looked at the page over her shoulder. Glassman, he said. Damien stopped a conversation about him at a dinner in March. Reeves brought the name up, and Damien's entire affect changed. He redirected the table inside 30 seconds. She tapped the page. I've been trying to remember it for 4 days. It came to me this morning. Lucien straightened, said something across the room to a man named Bosch, who was the quietest of the three who worked in the East Wing and who seemed to exist in a permanent state of processing information that hadn't reached the rest of the room yet. Bosch typed for 30 seconds, said, Carl Glassman, former FBI Deputy Director, Financial Crimes Division, retired 2021. Currently a senior partner at a private intelligence firm called Veritas Consulting. Silence. Veritas does corporate intelligence work, Bosch continued. Opposition research. Also, and this is less public, asset tracking for high net worth clients in sensitive situations. Lucien looked at Serafina. Damien hired a former FBI man to track your assets, she said. Or mine, Lucien said. Or both. She thought about her father's credit line, called in without explanation 6 months ago. The kind of move that required knowing exactly how much pressure to apply and exactly where. Both, she said. Lucien pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, which was unusual. He generally stood or moved, rarely settled. He looked at the legal pad for a moment, the 47 pages of her handwriting, and something crossed his face that she had started to recognize. A particular quality of attention that was different from his default watchfulness, something that came from a deeper place. You've been doing this for 4 days, he said. Yes. Without being asked. She met his eyes. You showed me the board. You showed me what he did to my father's business. You showed me the senator's name and the timeline of the council bribes. A pause. What did you think I was going to do with that? He held her gaze for a moment. Most people would have been frightened. I was frightened, she said. I wrote faster. Something moved in his face. That architecture of a smile again, there and gone. Glassman, he said to Bosch. Already on it, Bosch said. That was the 4th day. On the 6th day, Celeste called. Serafina was on the terrace when her phone rang, the wide stone terrace that faced the water, where she had taken to standing in the early evenings when the light went gray-gold and the Atlantic looked less like a threat and more like a fact of the world you could make your peace with. She looked at the screen. The contact still said only C because she had never gotten around to changing it back to Celeste after the period 2 years ago when they hadn't spoken for 7 months over something that seemed, in retrospect, entirely engineered by Damien. She answered. Sarah. Celeste's voice was wrong, too thin, compressed at the edges in the way voices get when someone has been crying recently enough that the residue is still there. Celeste. A silence. Then, he went through my phone. Serafina said nothing. Damien, this morning, I woke up and he had my phone and he was reading things. And when I asked him what he was doing, he looked at me like a pause. The sound of Celeste swallowing. He looked at me the way he used to look at you. Serafina closed her eyes briefly, opened them. What did he find? She said. Nothing. I haven't spoken to anyone, but he didn't believe me. He has people watching the apartment now. I can feel them. There's a man who stands at the corner of the street every morning who wasn't there before. Celeste. She kept her voice flat. Why are you calling me? A long pause. Because I'm scared. The word landed somewhere complicated. Serafina turned it over. You're scared, she said. Sarah E., you slept with my fiancé for how long? 2 years? And you wore our mother's necklace to my wedding and stood on Damien's arm in front of 400 people while my father collapsed against a wall, and now you're scared, so you call me. Silence on the other end. Yes, Celeste said very quietly. I'm calling you. Why? Because there isn't anyone else. Her voice broke cleanly on the last word, not theatrically, but in the way things break when there's nothing left to hold them. Because there has never been anyone else. You know that. Serafina stood on the terrace with the wind off the water moving through her hair and the phone pressed to her ear, and felt something she didn't want to feel, something she would have strongly preferred to table for a later, more convenient time. Don't tell Damien you called me, she said finally. I know. Don't tell anyone. I know, Sarah. I'm not. This isn't forgiveness. You understand that? Yes. Celeste's voice was very small. I know. She hung up and stood there for another minute. Then she went back inside and found Lucien in the hallway and said, Celeste is in trouble. Lucien looked at her. Damien is surveilling her. She's scared enough to reach out to me. She watched his face. I need to know if that's useful to you. He was quiet for a moment. It could be. If she's willing to. She's not an asset, Serafina said. She's my sister. Whatever we do with this, that's the frame. A beat. Understood, he said. She nodded and walked past him toward the east wing, and he watched her go with an expression that Marco, coming around the corner at that moment and nearly walking into him, would later describe to Bosch as the face he makes when something surprises him, which is almost never, so pay attention when you see it. The break came on the 9th day. Bosch found the Glassman connection at 4 in the morning, and by the time Serafina came downstairs at 6, the east wing had the pressurized atmosphere of a room where sleep had been optional for hours. Empty coffee cups. A smell of concentrated effort. Bosch's eyes had the particular flat brightness of someone running on the other side of tired. Glassman's firm has a shell subsidiary, Bosch said when she appeared. Registered in Delaware. The subsidiary has a single client contract with a holding company that traces back, through 3 layers, to CrossCorp. What's the contract for? Lucien asked. Port access facilitation and logistics coordination. Bosch turned his laptop screen toward the room. Which is not what Veritas does. Veritas does intelligence work. Port access means shipping manifests, Serafina said. Both men looked at her. Damien was trying to access Moretti shipping manifests through a back channel. He needed federal cover to do it cleanly. Glassman gives him that. If the manifests show anything that could be construed as illegal transport, Lucien said. His voice was entirely level. Yes. Has he found anything? She asked. Lucien and Bosch exchanged a look that told her everything. What did he find? She said. 3 years ago, Lucien said, before I began transitioning the operation, there were shipments. The documentation was not complete. How incomplete? A pause. Enough, he said. She sat down. So Damien has evidence of past criminal transport in your shipping operation, and he's been holding it, waiting for the right moment to hand it to a prosecutor who owes him, Lucien said. Yes. Winslow. The DA. She looked at the whiteboard. Winslow's name was there. She had noted the connection 11 days ago from a dinner conversation she'd reconstructed from memory. A fundraiser. October, 2 years back. Damien and Winslow in a corner for 20 minutes while she stood with Winslow's wife and listened to the woman talk about a kitchen renovation and watched Damien's body language in her peripheral vision the way she always did in rooms like that. The particular posture of 2 people agreeing on something that required agreeing in private. He's going to move soon, she said. Yes. The press statement. Calling you a predator. That was the first step. He's building a public narrative before the legal one drops, so the arrest looks like confirmation of what everyone already suspects. She looked at Lucien. How long do we have? Bosch? Best guess, 2 weeks, maybe 10 days. Bosch closed the laptop. He'll want to move before the Moretti operation can bury anything. Serafina looked at the whiteboard for a long time. Then we move first, she said. Lucien said, On what basis? Reeves, she said. Cross-Corp's outside counsel. He knows where the Hartley manipulation is documented. He was at that dinner, he heard Glassman's name used in a context that scared him enough to bring it up with Damien present, which means he already has doubts about his exposure. She turned to look at Lucien directly. He's a lawyer who is starting to understand that his client's legal problems are going to become his legal problems. That's a man who is looking for a door. Silence in the room. I know his wife, she added. We were on a museum board together for 2 years. I can get to him. Bosch looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at Serafina. You'd be visible, he said. Damien would know you made contact. Damien already knows I'm not sitting here doing nothing. She held his gaze. He knows who I'm with. He's trying to destroy you through legal channels because he can't reach you directly. If I'm the one who flips his counsel, that's not just a legal blow. That's personal. That's the kind of injury that makes men panic. Panicking men make mistakes, Lucien said. That's what you've been waiting for. Another silence, different in texture from the ones before it. Something was shifting in the room, in the particular alignment of things. Give me 48 hours, she said. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. 4. 48 hours, he said. She made the call to Reeves' wife that morning. Lunch the following day, a restaurant in the city, neutral ground, the kind of place where the tables were far enough apart that conversation didn't carry. She dressed carefully, not the way she used to dress for Damien's events, the performative elegance of a woman who had been curated for a role, but with the specific intention of a woman who knows what she's doing. Dark blazer, minimal jewelry. She looked like herself, which was something she was still relearning. Marco drove her. She didn't ask if this was Lucien's instruction or his own initiative. Either way, she was grateful for the company, for Marco's relentless, slightly exhausting conversation that prevented her from sitting inside her own head for the 40-minute drive. He talks about you, Marco said, at a red light. She glanced at him. Lucien, since you started working in the East Wing. Marco kept his eyes on the road. He doesn't say much, but when you're not in the room, he looks at the door. She said nothing. I've known him my whole life, Marco said. I've never seen him look at a door. The light changed. Keep your eyes on the road, Serafina said. Marco smiled and did. Reeves's wife was a careful woman, which meant the lunch was careful. Surface conversation for 40 minutes, the restaurant's noise doing its work, and then a shift in the conversation that Serafina initiated with the precision of someone who has learned to wait for the right moment and knows what it feels like when it arrives. She didn't threaten. She didn't offer anything directly. She simply made it clear, through the quiet and specific vocabulary of women who have sat across from each other at enough board meetings to understand subtext, that there was a version of the next 6 months in which Mitchell Reeves emerged on the right side of a federal investigation, and a version in which he did not, and that the determining factor was a decision he needed to make before Damien Cross made it for him. Reeves's wife was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, He'll want to speak to someone with legal standing. That can be arranged, Serafina said. She was back at the estate by 4. Lucien was on the terrace, rare, him being still in daylight hours outside the East Wing, and she came to stand beside him and looked at the water and said, Reeves will talk. Lucien turned to look at her. Give me 3 days, she said. I need to... His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something changed in his face. A compression, a going inward. Lucien. She read it. What is it? He was already moving toward the door. Stay here, he said. What? Stay in the house, Serafina. He said her full name, which he almost never did, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him yet. Not panic, he was clearly not a man who panicked, but something beneath composure, something that composure was being used to contain. She did not stay in the house. She followed him to the east wing, where Bosch was already standing with his phone to his ear and a face that had gone the color of old concrete, and where Marco had appeared from somewhere with his jacket still on, like he'd never made it fully inside from wherever he'd been, and the energy in the room had the particular vibration of bad news that had just arrived and hadn't finished arriving yet. "What happened?" she said. Bosch looked at Lucien. Lucien gave the smallest nod. "Someone tipped off Damien," Bosch said, "about a meeting at the harbor tonight. We had 3 men there doing a routine manifest verification." He stopped. "They were ambushed." The word sat in the room. "How bad?" Lucien said. 2 in the hospital. 1... Bosch stopped again. Shorter stopped this time, like he'd hit a wall. "Ricci didn't make it." Marco made a sound that wasn't words, moved toward the window. "Ricci," Lucien said. 1 word, flat. "Yes." Serafina stood very still in the doorway. "The information about the meeting," she said. "Who had it?" The room was quiet. "Small group," Bosch said, not looking at her. "Inside only, no external communication." She looked at Lucien. He was looking at the whiteboard with an expression she had never seen on him, something that was being held very deliberately behind his eyes. "Someone in this house told Damien about the harbor meeting," she said. Nobody corrected her. The silence that followed was of the kind that changes rooms permanently. Not the silence before something, but the silence that is itself the thing, the sound of a certainty landing. She thought about the 4 days of notes, the 47 pages of reconstructed conversations, the name Glassman on page 48. She thought about the East Wing, the 3 men at the table, the information that had moved through this house for 9 days. She thought about the phone call from Celeste. "He went through my phone. There's a man who stands at the corner of the street every morning." She thought about the call Celeste had made, the number on Serafina's screen, the fact that a call to Serafina's cell phone from Celeste's number could be, if someone were watching Celeste's communications closely enough, a data point, a location ping, a confirmation of contact, a door. "Lucien," she said. He turned. "The call Celeste made to me," she said, 6 days ago. "If Damien has Glassman's resources, if he's tracking her communications..." She watched him put it together. "He would know she called you," he said. "He would know she called me from wherever she was. And if he has a tap on her phone rather than just a visual, he'd have the content of the call," Lucien said. His voice had gone very quiet. "She told me she was scared," Serafina said. "She told me he was surveilling her. She told me she felt watched." She looked at him directly. "What if that call wasn't Celeste panicking? What if Damien found out she had doubts and what if he put the phone in her hand?" The room held very still. "He used her," Marco said from the window, not turning around. "He used Celeste to find the house." "She might not have known," Serafina said, and hated that she meant it. "Or she might have," Bosch said, and his voice was not unkind. Lucien turned back to the whiteboard. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at it for a long moment, and she could see, from where she stood, the exact point at which he stopped processing what had happened and started processing what happened next. "Ricci," Marco said from the window. His voice had gone rough at the base. "He had a daughter." Nobody answered. Lucien said quietly to Bosch, "Get me everything on Glassman's team, movements, locations, resources. I want it in an hour." "You're going to the harbor," Serafina said. He didn't confirm or deny. "Lucien." She walked into the room fully, past Bosch, past the table with its empty cups and its open laptops, and she stopped in front of him and looked up at his face, and the thing she saw there, not cold, not calculating, something rawer than that, something he was not all the way successful at keeping contained, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. "Don't go alone," she said. "I won't be alone." "You know what I mean." He looked at her for a moment, and in that moment the room was just the two of them inside it, the way rooms sometimes narrow to fit only the essential thing. "I'll be back by midnight," he said. She stood on the terrace at 9 o'clock and watched the dark water and did not go back inside. The wind had picked up, coming in cold off the Atlantic, And she wrapped her arms around herself and stood there because standing there was something to do and she had run out of other things. At 11:17, her phone rang. An unknown number. She answered it. A man's voice, unfamiliar, calm in the way of someone who has made a professional practice of being calm. "Ms. Vale," he said. "My name is Carl Glassman." She stopped breathing. "I understand you've been looking into my work," he said. "I think it's time we had a direct conversation, particularly given what's happening at the harbor right now." She gripped the phone. "Where is Lucien?" she said. A pause. "That," Glassman said, "is exactly what we should talk about." And in the dark below the terrace, the Atlantic went on moving against the rocks, indifferent and enormous, and from somewhere across the water, far enough that it might have been imagined, close enough that it was not, came the faint, flat sound of, she heard it clearly on the second beat of silence after the shot. Not the movie's version of it, not the clean dramatic crack, but the real thing, flat and percussive and swallowed almost immediately by wind and distance. Then another, then a third, in a different register, from a different direction. She stood on the terrace with the phone still at her ear. "Ms. Vale," Glassman said. "Where is he?" Not a question this time, something harder than a question. "The harbor," Glassman said. "Pier 14. That's where Damien's people took him approximately 20 minutes ago. He's alive. That's the relevant information for you right now. Whether he stays that way depends considerably on what you decide in the next few minutes." The wind came off the water. She gripped the railing with her free hand, felt the cold iron bite into her palm. "What do you want?" she said. "I want you to understand your situation clearly," Glassman said. He had the voice of a man who had given difficult information to people under pressure for most of his professional life. Modulated, precise, almost kind in its efficiency. "Damien Cross has been planning this evening for 6 weeks. The harbor ambush, the leverage on Lucien's past manifests, the DA contact. Tonight was designed as a closing move." "But you're calling me?" "Yes." "Which means you're not entirely inside the plan anymore." A pause. Brief, but she caught it. "I do corporate intelligence work," Glassman said. "I document, I analyze, I don't. What happened to Ricci tonight was not in my brief. There are lines." "Former FBI," she said. "Still has lines. Everyone has lines, Ms. Vale. Some people just find them later than others." She looked out at the water. The gunfire had stopped. The silence it left behind was worse than the sound. "What does Damien want?" she said. "He wants Lucien Moretti to sign a document," Glassman said, "transferring operational control of the Moretti shipping licenses to a cross-corp subsidiary, in exchange for which the manifest evidence goes to Winslow and Lucien walks away." "Walks away from everything." "From the business his father built, yes. From New York, from the operation, and from you, specifically. That's written into the terms. You return to the cross-orbit, the public narrative resets, and this week becomes a story about a vulnerable woman who was manipulated by a dangerous man." She breathed. "And if he doesn't sign?" "Then the manifests go to Winslow tonight, and Damien calls it cooperation with federal investigators. The arrest happens before morning." "And what happens to Lucien at Pier 14 while we're waiting for that?" The pause this time was longer. "I don't know," Glassman said, and she heard something underneath the professional calm that might, in another context, have been honest. "I have location. I don't have visibility on conditions." She closed her eyes, opened them. "Can you get me there?" she said. "That's not—" "Glassman." She said his name like a door closing. "You called me because you want something off your conscience. I'm giving you the opportunity. Can you get me to Pier 14 or not?" A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. "There's a car at the east gate," he said. "The driver knows the route." She was inside and moving before the call ended. Bosch was in the east wing. She told him in 12 words what Glassman had told her and watched his face do 3 things in rapid succession: disbelief, calculation, decision. "I'll get Marco," he said. "No." She grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door. "Marco stays. I need someone here who can manage communications if this goes wrong. I need Reeves's number. Now. And I need whatever you have on Winslow that we can move to a federal contact above his level." Bosch stared at her. Do you have it or not? I have it, he said, and his voice had shifted into the flat operational register she had heard him use with Lucian, but never before directed at her. Send it to my phone in the next 10 minutes. She zipped the jacket. If I'm not back by 2, you release it to the federal contact and you call the number labeled Reeves W in my phone, and you tell her the door just opened all the way. She was at the east gate in 4 minutes. The car was there. Black, no plates visible in the dark. The driver was a man she'd never seen, somewhere in his 50s, who looked at her once and then looked at the road and did not look at her again for the entire drive, which suited her precisely. She sat in the back and checked her phone. Bosch had sent 3 files in a compressed folder already. She opened the first one, a financial thread connecting Winslow to a cross-corp adjacent PAC through 2 intermediate entities. And the data was clean and specific and exactly the kind of thing that makes federal prosecutors above a certain level take their calls on the first ring. She thought about Lucien at Pier 14. She thought about him saying, "I'll be back by midnight," with the same tone he used to say everything, level, unhurried, certain. And she thought about the fraction of a degree shift in his expression in the east wing doorway when she told him not to go alone. And she pressed her palm flat against her thigh and did not think about what conditions meant in Glassman's usage. The harbor. She smelled it before she saw it, salt and diesel and something ferric beneath that, copper-edged, that her brain identified before she finished the identification. The car stopped 2 blocks from the pier entrance, behind a warehouse with its loading bay dark. The driver said, "Far as I go." She got out. Pier 14 was lit, not fully, the overhead industrials only partially functional, casting hard pools of yellow-white light with long shadows between them. She could see from the warehouse corner 3 vehicles parked at angles near the pier's midpoint. 2 men visible near the vehicles. More inside the shadows beyond the light pools, movement that registered as presence without resolving into detail. She also saw Lucien. He was on his feet. She needed a moment with that, a full breath of relief at the vertical posture, but his hands were bound behind him with what looked like zip ties, and there was something wrong with the way he was holding his left side, a tension in the way he stood, the specific adjustment of someone redistributing weight away from pain. His face from this distance was unreadable, but his jaw was set and his head was up, and he was looking at the man standing in front of him with an expression she knew now, the one that was not anger, but the thing that lives beneath anger, when someone has decided that fear is no longer a useful investment. The man in front of him was Damien Cross. Damien looked different from the last time she'd seen him. The composed, glossy surface she had lived alongside for 4 years had deteriorated in a specific way. Not broken down entirely, but running at higher RPM than it was designed for. The machinery of him audible in the tension of his shoulders. The way he moved when he spoke. He had a gun. He was holding it with the practiced grip of someone who had spent money on lessons but not enough time on instinct. There were 6 other men she could count, armed, positioned. She was one person with a phone and 47 pages of notes, and a compressed file from Bosch. She stepped out of the shadow. "Damien." Every head turned. The silence on the pier had the quality of a held breath. One of the armed men moved immediately toward her, and Damien raised his free hand. "Stop." And the man stopped. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she could not name. Not the inconvenience expression from the preparation room. Not the public composure from the press statement. Something older than both of those. Something that had been underneath them all along. "Serafina," he said. She walked toward him. Measured, deliberate steps on the wet concrete. The sound of water against the pier structure constant below and around them. The smell of the harbor in the back of her throat. She didn't look at Lucien. If she looked at Lucien, she would make a different set of decisions. One's driven by something she wasn't ready to name in the middle of a harbor at midnight with 6 guns in the vicinity. "Put the gun down," she said to Damien. "I don't think so." "You're not going to use it." "You don't know that." "I do." She stopped 8 feet from him. "Because if you were going to use it, you would have done it before I walked onto this pier, and the fact that you didn't means you still want something. You still think this ends the way you planned it." Damien looked at her. The gun didn't move. "Come home," he said. The words landed so flatly, so wrong in the harbor air, that it took her brain a full second to process them as sincere. "Come home," he said again. "End this. The papers get signed, the evidence goes nowhere, your father's business gets restored, and we—" "Stop." Her voice was quiet and very hard. "Serafina." "I said stop." She took one more step toward him. "You destroyed my father's credit line to force a wedding timeline. You used my sister, who is not a strong person and has never been, and you knew that. You used her for 2 years while planning to discard her the moment it suited you. You killed a man tonight who had a daughter." Her voice didn't waver. She was somewhere past the point where it could waver. "And you're standing here saying, 'Come home.'" Damien's jaw tightened. "You belong with me," he said. She looked at him, this man she had planned a life around, and she felt something complete itself inside her. Not closure, nothing as clean as that, but a final mapping of the damage, a full accounting. "No," she said, "I never did." She saw it happen in his face. The decision, the tipping point past which his version of composure could not hold. His grip on the gun shifted. She tracked it in her peripheral vision and knew before his arm moved what direction it was going. Not toward her, toward Lucienne. She moved, not thought, body, pure and instinctive, the way you move in dreams where the body decides before the mind engages. She crossed the distance in 2 steps and hit Damien's gun arm with both hands, pushing up and sideways, and the shot went into the sky somewhere, and the sound of it was enormous and flat, and the recoil threw both of them sideways, and she felt her knee hit the wet concrete hard enough to send white pain up through her thigh. Then everything happened at once. The armed men on the pier moved, but other men were moving also. From the darkness beyond the light pools, from behind the containers along the pier edge, figures resolving out of shadow with the coordinated efficiency of people who had been waiting in position and had just received a signal. She counted 4, 5 more, and she recognized Bosch's voice somewhere in the dark, even though she hadn't asked him to come and had specifically told him not to, and she understood that Bosch had been with Lucien long enough to know that direct orders sometimes required creative reinterpretation. Damien scrambled for the gun on the wet concrete. She got to it first. She picked it up and stood and turned and pointed it at Damien Cross, and her hand was not shaking. The pier had become a chaos of running figures and shouts, and the sound of something heavy hitting the ground somewhere in the dark. A gun went off at the far end of the pier, then another, and then there was the particular sound of men fighting at close quarters. Impact sounds, labored breathing amplified in the open air. Damien stood 3 feet from her. He looked at the gun in her hand. "You won't," he said. She looked at him steadily. The concrete was wet under her knees, and she was going to have a bruise down the entire left side of her leg, and her heart was hitting her ribs at a rate that made sound. "She won't have to." Lucien's voice. She heard the zip ties hit the concrete. Someone had cut them. And she heard Lucien's footsteps, and then he was beside her, close enough that his arm touched hers, and she felt the solidity of him there, with something she would examine later and not now. Damien looked at both of them. His composure was gone. Fully and finally. The surface that had held for years, the glossy architecture of a man who had controlled every room he entered, dismantled on a wet harbor pier at midnight. What was underneath was something smaller, younger. Something that had spent a very long time being afraid that people would see through the architecture to the thing it was built to conceal. "It's over," Lucien said. His voice was rough at the edges. She could hear the effort it took to make it even. His left hand was pressed against his side, and the fabric there was dark in a way that was not the ambient light. "You're bleeding," she said to Lucien. "I'm aware," he said. "How bad?" "We can discuss it later." "Lucien!" "Later." He said it with the particular finality of a man who is absolutely certain he will survive the next 10 minutes and is focused on the things that happen in them. She looked at Damien. 2 of Bosch's men were behind him now. He had nowhere to move. He knew it. She watched him know it, the intelligence behind his eyes running calculations and arriving at the same answer from every direction. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She kept the gun on Damien and pulled the phone with her free hand. Looked at the screen. A message from Bosch, from a number she didn't recognize, forwarded. Federal contact confirmed receipt. Winslow suspended pending review. DA's office contacted. Stand by. She turned the phone screen toward Damien. She watched him read it. She watched something happen in his face that she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe, and could only ever get close to by saying it was the face of a man who had believed completely, and for a very long time, that the rules applied to other people. Reeves signed a statement this afternoon, she said. Hartley Capital, the Senate bribes, the Glassman contract, all of it. Winslow has been suspended. The federal contact above him has the documentation. She held the phone steady. The manifests don't matter anymore. There's nothing left to hand anyone. The sound of the harbor, water against pilings. Somewhere at the far end of the pier, a voice calling out. Bosch's, she thought, coordinating something. Damien looked at her for a long time. She could see him breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, faster than he would have wanted it. Then he laughed. It was a short sound, not warm, containing nothing that resembled humor. You were never the safe choice, he said. No, she said. I never was. One of the men behind him moved forward. Damien turned, and the composure that had dissolved tried to reassemble itself one final time, and failed, and he was taken off the pier looking like a man who had finally, completely run out of architecture to hide behind. She lowered the gun. Her hands, she noticed now, were shaking. Had probably been shaking for some time without her awareness, the body accounting for itself only once the immediate requirement of function had passed. Lucienne sat down on a piling, not the graceful version of sitting, the version where your legs have conducted a quiet internal vote and lost patience with standing. He pressed his hand harder against his left side and looked at the concrete between his feet and breathed with the careful, measured rhythm of someone managing something. She crouched in front of him. Show me, she said. It's a graze. Lucienne. He moved his hand. The fabric beneath it was wet and dark, and the wound beneath that was not a graze exactly, but not as bad as the blood suggested. A cut, deep enough to matter, not deep enough to be the worst thing. She pressed his hand back over it. Hold that, she said. I know. Hold it hard. I know, Serafina. She looked at his face from 6 inches away. In the mixed light of the harbor, the overhead industrials, the distant city glow on the water, he looked worn in a way that was different from tired, the way things look when they've been tested to near their limit and have held. You sent Bosch, she said. No. He was here. He made his own decision. A slight pause. I may have communicated our location before I left. That's not the same as not sending him. It's a meaningful distinction. She almost laughed, stopped it, pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck to check his pulse and found it strong and fast. Marco's going to be furious that he missed this, she said. Marco is going to be dramatic about it for weeks, Lucian said. Are you actually all right? He looked at her, not the professional look, not the watchful calculation she had mapped over 9 days. Something stripped of those, something that had been under them all along, and that the harbor and the blood loss and the midnight concrete had made available. Ask me again in an hour, he said. She stayed crouched in front of him, her hand still on his neck, his pulse under her fingertips. The harbor moved around them. Bosch was coordinating somewhere behind her. There were things that needed handling. Glassman, the federal contacts, the documentation, Winslow's suspension, the man at the end of the pier who had spent years engineering destruction and had just watched it turn on him completely. There were 15 things that needed to happen in the next 2 hours, and she knew all of them and would begin working through them methodically as soon as she stood up. But for this moment, she stayed where she was. Celeste, Lucian said. She'd been holding that. I know. She may not have... I know. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to deal with that. He studied her face. I know you are, he said, and in his voice was something she had not heard from him directed at anyone. Not Bosch, not Marco, not the men who had worked for him for years. Something that recognized her as the specific person she was, that had tracked her across 9 days of legal pads and harbor piers and midnight phone calls and arrived at a conclusion. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at it. Bosch, EMT on site in 4 minutes. Also, you might want to know about Celeste. She looked up from the phone. Lucien was watching her. What? She said. He shook his head slightly, which she understood to mean not here, not yet. And she understood also that the thing Bosch had texted her about was not going to be simple, and that simple was a country she had stopped expecting to. She read Bosch's full message in the ambulance. Lucien was beside her with a paramedic working on his side and an IV line going in, and the particular expression of a man who has decided that medical attention is something to endure rather than receive. And she sat on the bench opposite and read the message twice, and then put the phone face down on her knee. Celeste is at the old cathedral, she said. Lucien looked at her over the paramedic's shoulder. She's been there since this afternoon, Serafina said. Bosch's man tracked her phone. She left Damien's apartment 6 hours ago with a bag and she went there and she hasn't moved. Alone? As far as they can tell. She paused. She has Damien's emergency contact list on her phone. She has names, numbers, things Damien would not want in anyone else's hands right now. Is she going to use them? I don't know. She looked at the phone. She called me twice while I was on the pier. I didn't pick up. The ambulance moved through the city, and she sat with the phone on her knee and felt the specific weight of a decision she had been postponing since the harbor. The paramedic said something to Lucien about keeping pressure on it. Lucien said something back that the paramedic received with the professional patience of someone accustomed to uncooperative patients. Don't, she said to Lucien. He looked at her. Whatever you're about to tell the paramedic, don't. Let him do his job. A pause. Fine, Lucy said, which was the least graceful she had ever heard him sound. And something about that, the smallness of it, the entirely human irritation of a man who controlled significant portions of the eastern seaboard's shipping infrastructure being told to hold still by a paramedic in his 30s, made her chest do something complicated. I have to go to the cathedral, she said. I know. Alone. He looked at her steadily. She could see him calculating. Not whether she was capable, she understood that he had settled that question some time ago, but the risk variables, the exposure, the geometry of a situation in which Serafina Vale walked into an empty building at 1 a.m. to talk to the sister who had helped destroy her. Bosch stays outside, he said. Bosch can stay outside. And you call when you're in. Yes. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once, which was Lucien's version of a great many things, and she stood and told the paramedic she needed to exit at the next block. And she did, into the cold night air, and she stood on the sidewalk and watched the ambulance continue. And then she turned and walked. The old St. Carver's Cathedral stood on the corner of a block that the city had been slowly decommissioning for a decade. The surrounding buildings variously abandoned, repurposed, mid-renovation, mid-collapse. The cathedral itself had been decommissioned 3 years ago when the congregation relocated to a newer facility uptown, and what remained was the structure, stone, enormous, intact but emptied, its windows dark except for one on the eastern side where a faint, irregular light moved. Candles. Bosch's car was already on the block when she arrived, engine off, him visible as a shape in the driver's seat. She walked past it without stopping. He did not follow. The side door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit her first, dust and extinguished wax and the particular cold of large enclosed spaces that haven't been heated in years, and underneath that, faintly, the ghost of white roses going brown in their arrangements. The decorations from the wedding that never happened had never been fully cleared. They hadn't been anyone's responsibility once the event collapsed, and so they remained. Wilted flowers in floor vases along the aisle, white ribbon wound around the end posts of empty pews, lengths of tulle hanging from the upper gallery railings, gone ivory with dust. It looked, in the candlelight, like the inside of a stopped clock. Celeste was at the front. She was sitting in the first pew on the left, the bride's side, which had not been chosen deliberately, or if it had been, the deliberateness of it was doing its own kind of work. She was wearing dark clothes, a bag on the pew beside her, and she was holding a candle in a glass jar, the kind you buy at a corner bodega, and she was looking at the floor in front of her with the expression of someone who has been sitting in the same position long enough that movement has begun to seem like a concept that applies to other people. She looked up when she heard Serafina's footsteps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Celeste had lost the green dress. She had lost also the particular quality she'd had at the cathedral 11 days ago, the brittle, terrified brightness of a person performing their own triumph. What was left was younger and worse. Her face without the performance was the face Serafina remembered from childhood, from the years before Celeste had learned to want things she couldn't have and to take them anyway. "You came," Celeste said. "Yes." Serafina walked down the aisle, sat down in the pew across from her sister, the groom's side, the empty space between them, the precise width of everything that had happened. Celeste looked at her for a long time. "I didn't know about tonight," she said. "The harbor. I need you to know that. Tell me what you did know." A pause. The candle flame moved in some unfelt draft. "He found my phone," Celeste said. 3 weeks ago. He went through it. Your number was in it, the text thread. He didn't say anything at the time, but then he gave me back the phone, and 2 days later he was different, quieter. And then a week ago he put the phone in my hand and he told me to call you. He told you what to say. He told me to say I was scared, that he was surveilling me." She pressed her lips together, which was, it was true. All of it was true. I was scared. He was watching me. But the call, he wanted to know where you were. Serafina looked at her sister's face. "Did you know that's what it was for?" she said. The pause before Celeste answered was 3 seconds long and contained everything. "I thought—" Celeste stopped, started again. I told myself it was just a call, that I was just talking to you, that it wasn't—" Her voice fractured along the word. "I knew," she said, flat and quiet and absolute. "I knew what he was using it for. I let myself believe I didn't because believing I didn't was easier than the other thing." The candle between them burned. "Ricci," Serafina said, "one of Lucien's men. He died tonight." Celeste closed her eyes. "He had a daughter," Serafina said. "She's 11. The silence in the cathedral was very large. "I know," Celeste said, and her voice was barely sound. Serafina looked at the altar ahead of them, the bare stone of it, stripped of whatever had adorned it before the decommission. Behind it, the east window, dark glass, no light coming through from outside, just the reflection of the candle flame repeated in the panes. She thought about what she had wanted to say to Celeste for 11 days. She had rehearsed versions of it in the east wing and on the terrace and in the ambulance, all the shapes that the anger could take, all the precise and accurate ways she could describe the damage. She had 47 pages of evidence about Damien Cross, and not one of them required the kind of accounting she could do right now, in this building, with the sister who had participated in her destruction. She looked at Celeste's face. She saw the 9-year-old in the kitchen, hands together at the waist, making herself smaller, having taken something that didn't belong to her and knowing it and not knowing, yet how to be someone who didn't do that. "Give me the necklace," Serafina said. Celeste reached up without hesitation. The clasp took a moment. Her fingers were cold, clumsy, and then the 3 strands of antique gold came away from her throat, and she held them out across the space between the pews. Serafina took them. The metal was warm from Celeste's skin. She held the sapphire pendant between 2 fingers and looked at it for a moment, this thing that had been her mother's and then had spent 11 days in the wrong place. She put it on. "What happens now?" Celeste said. "To Damien," Serafina said. "Federal charges. The documentation is substantial. Reeves signed a statement. The DA above Winslow has everything." She paused. "He'll be in litigation for years. He won't win." "I meant to me." Serafina looked at her sister. "That depends on what you do in the next week," she said. "The contact numbers on Damien's emergency list, federal investigators will want them. That's your decision. But I'll tell you what I'd tell anyone who has information and is deciding whether to use it. The side of the table you sit on in the beginning is usually the side you stay on." Celeste was quiet. "I have a lawyer," Serafina said. "I'll give you the number. You call him tonight, not tomorrow. He'll tell you what cooperation looks like and what it costs and what it doesn't cost." A pause. "The rest is yours to figure out." That's all you're going to give me?" "Yes." She said it without heat. "Yes, Celeste, that's all." The candle burned between them. "I spent my whole life," Celeste said slowly, "being the other one, being the younger one, being the one that—" She stopped. The words reorganized themselves. "Mom used to call you her North Star. Did you know that? She said it when you weren't in the room. She'd watch you walk out of the room and she'd say it to whoever was there." Her voice was steady now, which was harder to listen to than if it had broken. "I heard her say it when I was 12. I heard her say it 3 more times before she died." Serafina felt the pendant at her throat, warm metal, 3 strands. "She never called me anything like that," Celeste said. "No," Serafina said quietly. "She didn't." Celeste looked at her, perhaps waiting for the other half of that. The reassurance, the revision, the thing people said to make the true thing hurt less. Serafina didn't say it. "She loved you," she said instead. "She just didn't always know how to show you the right way. She was better at it with me. I don't know why. That's not something I can fix." She looked at her sister directly. "But you used that for 20 years as a reason to take things that weren't yours. And that's something I can't fix either. That's yours." The silence held. Then Celeste nodded, once, the smallest movement, and something in her posture shifted. Not resolved, nothing as clean as resolved, but a fraction less defended, a fraction less armored, the way things get when a lie that has been structural finally gets removed and the structure doesn't collapse, just settles into its actual shape. "Call the lawyer," Serafina said. She stood up from the pew. "Tonight." She put the number on the pew between them and walked back down the aisle through the ghost of the wedding that had never happened. At the door she stopped, turned. "Celeste." Her sister looked up. "The man who stands on the corner every morning isn't Damien's anymore. But someone's going to be watching you while you decide what to do. That's not a threat." She held her sister's gaze. "It's the last thing I can give you right now." She walked out into the night. Bosch drove her to the hospital where Lucienne was in a private room being sewn up by a surgical resident who had the focused, slightly martyred expression of someone working on a patient who had opinions about everything. Marco was in the hallway, outside the room, pacing a groove in the linoleum, and he stopped when he saw her and looked at her face and said nothing, which was the most remarkable thing she had ever heard Marco do. She pushed open the door. Lucienne was propped up in the bed with the particular rigidity of a man refusing to look like he was in a hospital bed, and when she came in, he looked at her and she looked at him, and she sat down in the chair beside the bed without saying anything for a moment. "She's okay," she said finally. "Celeste, she's going to cooperate." "Good." She didn't know about Ricci, not in advance. She paused. She knew the call was being used to find me. She let herself not know that she knew. Lucien was quiet. "People do that," he said. "Yes." She looked at her hands in her lap. "People do that." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the bed beside him, and he turned his hand over so her palm was against his, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the hospital made its ambient sounds around them. Distant voices, the mechanical rhythm of equipment, the low, constant hum of a building that never fully sleeps. "Your father," Lucien said. "I'll call him in the morning, when there's something clean to tell him." "There's a great deal that's clean now." "Yes." She thought about Arthur Vale in his hospital bed 6 nights ago, gray-faced and frightened, his voice scraped raw. "Yes, there is." 1 year is not a long time, and it is also, in certain lives, everything. Damien Cross was indicted on 11 federal counts in the January following the harbor. The trial was brief. Not because the case was simple, but because the documentation was so complete that the defense spent most of its time in procedural challenges, each one denied, each denial a door closing. He was sentenced in the spring of the following year. Serafina did not attend either proceeding. She read the summaries in the morning and went back to work. Mitchell Reeves lost his law license and was assessed a substantial fine and spent 18 months in a minimum security facility in Connecticut, from which he emerged, by all accounts, a considerably quieter man. His wife filed for divorce while he was inside, and he did not contest it. Carl Glassman testified for the prosecution in exchange for reduced exposure and retired again to a house in coastal Maine that people who knew him said he had been threatening to move to for years. Winslow resigned before he was formally charged and moved to private practice and was not heard from publicly again. The Moretti operation changed, not overnight, nothing structural changes overnight, and Lucien did not pretend that it would or should. It changed the way river channels change when the water finds a different path. Gradually, following the geometry of least resistance and most sense, the shipping interests legitimizing, the labor practices regularizing, the men who had worked for the Moretti Syndicate finding that their skills translated into logistics and infrastructure with more ease than anyone had particularly expected. There were holdouts. There were men who didn't want the work to change because the work had been their identity, and those men were handled with varying degrees of difficulty and outcome. But the direction held, because Serafina made it hold in the specific way she made things hold, not through force or ideology, but through the patient, granular, unglamorous work of knowing what you want the structure to look like and showing up every day to build it. She became, in the year after the harbor, something that had no clean name. She was not a wife in the traditional sense. She and Lucien had filed a domestic partnership with the city rather than staging another ceremony, and the two people who witnessed it were Marco and a notary public named Phil, who charged $40 and had no opinions about the Moretti name. She was not a businesswoman in any conventional sense, though she worked with a precision and an appetite for the work that 3 different people described to her at different times as ferocious and meant it as a compliment. What she was, concretely, was this. She was the person who looked at the ruin of things and identified what could be rebuilt and built it. The old cathedral block became her first project. She had not planned it. She had walked past the building in February, 8 months after the harbor, and stood in front of it for a long time in the cold, looking at the stone face of it, the dark windows, the locked gate across the side entrance where she had walked in on a January night and found her sister in the dark. She bought the block in March. The cathedral itself became the anchor of what was eventually a 3-building development. Transitional housing on the north side, a community kitchen and resource center in the east building, and the cathedral space itself transformed, stone structure preserved, interior gutted and rebuilt, into a community arts and education center with a subsidized after-school program that ran 6 days a week and that was consistently over-enrolled from its first semester. The 11-year-old daughter of a man named Ricci was in the first cohort of the after-school program. Serafina had arranged it without announcement and without ceremony through a third party because some things are not gestures and should not be made to look like them. She never met the girl. She ensured the scholarship was funded for the full duration. Her father's business recovered. Not to its previous scale. The sold warehouse was gone and Arthur Vale was not, in the end, a man built for reconstruction at 70. But the credit was restored, the remaining operation stabilized, and Arthur Vale was able to retire with dignity into the apartment 2 miles from Serafina's office that she had found for him and that he had accepted after a period of resistance that they both understood was not really about the apartment. He came to dinner every Sunday. He and Lucien had a relationship that defied easy categorization. 2 men with nothing obvious in common who had arrived, through the particular alchemy of proximity and mutual respect for someone they both loved, at a wary, functional appreciation that occasionally surprised both of them with its warmth. Arthur called Lucien that man of yours with a consistency that was now affectionate rather than apprehensive, and Lucien called Arthur sir with a consistency that was entirely genuine, and Marco had long ago identified Sunday dinners as one of the more reliable pleasures of his week. Celeste testified. She sat in federal court on a Wednesday morning in November and gave 4 hours of testimony that was specific, documented, and visibly costly to her, and when she walked out of the courtroom, Serafina was in the hallway. Celeste stopped. Serafina looked at her sister. 11 months had done their own work on Celeste's face. The brittleness was gone, replaced by something less polished and more durable, the face of a person who has been stripped of their performance and has had to find out what was underneath and has not always liked what they found and has kept going anyway. They stood in the federal courthouse hallway for a moment. "Where are you going?" Serafina said. "I got a job offer," Celeste said. "Chicago, a design firm. It's small." Do you want it? I think so. A pause. I think I want to find out. Serafina looked at her sister. Then she reached out and put her hand briefly on Celeste's arm. Not a hug. They were not there yet, and might not be for a long time, and she was done pretending proximity that hadn't been earned. But the touch was real. It was what she had, and she gave it, and Celeste received it without flinching, and that was enough for the courthouse hallway on a Wednesday in November. Call me when you get there, Serafina said. Celeste nodded, picked up her bag, walked toward the elevator. Serafina watched her go. On a winter evening, the Atlantic had the color of pewter, the light going fast and the cold coming in off the water with the particular seriousness of December on the eastern seaboard. She was standing on the terrace barefoot. She had come out without shoes, following the impulse toward cold stone and open air that she had developed sometime in the preceding year as a way of getting out of her own head, with one hand resting against the curve of her stomach. She was 4 months along. They had found out in October, a Tuesday morning, a pharmacist's test kit, the bathroom off the master bedroom, Lucien sitting on the edge of the tub with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for approximately 30 seconds before he looked up with the expression of a man who has processed a large quantity of information very quickly and arrived somewhere he did not expect and is, against all reasonable prediction, entirely all right with it. He came out onto the terrace now. She heard the door and then his footsteps and then the warmth of him close behind her, and he put his coat around both of them against the wind the way he had started doing in November, and they stood looking at the water. Marco called, he said. The Chicago permitting came through on the restaurant. He's been waiting 3 years for that. He called me 5 times today. How many times did you pick up? 3, Lucien said, and she could hear in his voice the fraction of something that in another man would have been pride. She leaned back slightly against him, felt his arm come around her, his hand resting alongside hers against the curve of her stomach. The city's glow was visible on the horizon, that permanent amber low in the sky that meant human density and electricity and the 10 million ongoing stories of a place that never turned off. She had been part of that city's story in a way she hadn't intended and would not have chosen and would not, she understood this now, had understood it for some time, undo. You know, she said, if Damien hadn't betrayed me, Lucien's lips touched her temple. I know, he murmured. She turned in his arm to look at him. His face in the winter light was the face she had looked at across courtroom halls and hospital beds and harbor piers, the face she had learned the way you learn geography, not memorized but inhabited, known from having moved through it. No, she said, you don't. He raised an eyebrow. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had walked into a cathedral with no plan and offered her his hand and had not in the year since looked away. If he hadn't destroyed my life, she said, I would have spent the rest of it being the safe choice. She took his hand and held it against her heartbeat. And I never would have found out, she said, that I wasn't. The wind moved off the water. The lights of New York held steady on the horizon. She turned back to the ocean, and he kept his arm around her, and they stood on the stone terrace in the cold while the Atlantic did what it had always done, what it would keep doing long after every version of this story had been told and retold and worn smooth, advancing, retreating, writing and erasing and writing again on the same black rocks, indifferent to human damage and human repair and the particular stubborn persistence of people who have been broken and have declined against all reasonable expectation to stay that way. Below them, the water hit the cliffs and pulled back. Above them, the winter sky held its stars, and Serafina Vale stood between both, in the coat of a man who had never asked her to be anything other than what she was, with her hand over her own heartbeat, and the cold stone under her bare feet, and for the first time in as long as she could recall with any accuracy, she was exactly where she had chosen to be. Not safe, not chosen, choosing.